Thought it might be interesting to ramble for a minute without any sort of material in front of me, without any sort of provocation to talk about this topic or that topic. Just kind of vent what's on my mind. And people are scared to do that, I think, nowadays because everything is so polished and so refined down to the gnat's ass. And I think that there's a place for that. But, it's kind of interesting, I think, now and then to, just make one of these fumbling messes of a ramble that people, you have to actually have some patience. You actually have to listen to it. I've been thinking a lot about, I was watching a video from Kyle Kalinske of Secular Talk, who probably my favorite YouTuber outside of myself. I like the way that he speaks with such clarity on issues, and even when I don't agree with him, I think there's a strong logical consistency to the things that he makes, and I'm very supportive. I like to retweet his videos on my Twitter. I like to mention often that I have a profound respect for what he does. So I think that it's very important when he does say something that I disagree with, that I come forth and say, "Oh, well, I don't really buy into that." So I don't want this to come across as, "Oh, I'm trying to pwn Kyle Kalinske" or anything. But it was his video that really got me thinking about this argument, and he's far from the first one to make it. He's far from the only one to make it. It's a very common argument. So I don't know. I'll go ahead and in the editing process, I'll put the clip here.
Of course, there were countless examples of people comparing George W. Bush to looking like a monkey or an ape. Of course, there's examples of people comparing Donald Trump to that. Bill Maher did that famously in a joke that, by the way, Trump sued him over that. Eventually, of course, he dropped the lawsuit, but he sued Bill Maher over a joke which compared Trump to looking like, an orangutan or something like that. So, yeah, we all get that, dude. But why are you being so dense to the context of it? Which is, historically, when you compare, an African-American to an ape, that's part of a massive dehumanization effort. That's the same as okay, so Dave Chappelle wore whiteface to pretend to be a news anchor. Are we supposed to all be equally outraged by that as we are by somebody wearing blackface? Because there's a history connected to the blackface. It was used in minstrel shows to dehumanize black people, make them look stupid, and justify a system of open oppression against them. By the same token, comparing a black woman to an ape, yeah, that's going to land a little harsher than it would if you're comparing some white dude to an ape.
Like I said, that's an argument you've heard a million times before. And, it's really strange because you don't see it addressed very often, at least not in the way that I want to address it here. I don't really see, it's very strange because it's a very common argument in some circles, and you really don't hear people addressing it in a general sense. People tend to address it on a case-by-case basis. It's like the two sides of these issues are constantly talking past each other and not really paying attention to one another's points. So when it comes to this Roseanne thing, which is what's being discussed here, the two sides, the conservative side, at least some conservatives have just flatly said that, yeah, Roseanne's racist. I don't know what she was thinking, blah, blah, blah. A lot of people have made other arguments for, the argument that Alex Jones made, which I won't bother showing you, but the argument he made was essentially, a lot of people look like apes. And I even kind of addressed maybe some of that argument in a video I made about Roseanne, although I didn't really take a strong stance in that video. I just kind of described the situation. But the argument is, a lot of people look like apes, and if you compare a white person to an ape, no, you're not in trouble. If you compare a black person to an ape, you are in trouble. And the argument is, well, there's a double standard here. That's the Alex Jones argument. The argument from left-wingers whenever it comes to something like this is, well, you have to be mindful of the historical context. Black people were called monkeys to denigrate them, to denigrate their intelligence, to denigrate their humanity, so on and so forth. You have to look at the historical context of this stuff. And some other examples that were brought up was like Dave Chappelle is allowed to do whiteface, but a white person is not allowed to do blackface. And it's once again, oh, well, you got to look at the history. There's a history of white people dressing up in blackface to make a mockery of black people, to portray them as buffoonish or imbecilic or whatever. And we have to take these historical arguments into account. It was the same thing with the Civil War monuments, with both sides. That was kind of a unique one because both sides were championing the history, but in a different way. One side was saying, oh, the history is so grotesque that we have to take these monuments down because they're extolling something that's not very virtuous. They're extolling slavery. They're extolling racism. And then other people saying that, we have to acknowledge our history. We have to, and that all, and then talking about how all people are, in that realm of history, we could just as easily say, oh, well, any monument to the founding fathers must be bad. The Washington Monument shouldn't exist because Washington had slaves. The Jefferson Memorial shouldn't exist because he was a slave owner, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of back and forth on that stuff, with both sides kind of taking a different look at the historical perspective. But I'm kind of let me tell you where I'm at. I'm kind of sick of this idea that we should be governed by history to the extent that we are. I'm actually much more on Alex Jones's side of this issue than I am on Kyle Kalinski's, but I'll go ahead and defend Alex Jones's position here. I think that the defense of it is intent is what matters. If I dress up in blackface, I'm in trouble. And it doesn't matter what my intent is. It doesn't matter if there's not even there's no racist component to the intent, And it was like the Robert Downey Jr. performance in Tropic Thunder, or Marilyn Manson went around in blackface during the promotional stages of the golden age of grotesque. Lots of, there's been contemporary examples of blackface being used, and but it seems like most of it, like the last vestiges of it disappeared maybe 10, 15 years ago, and now it's just totally verboten to the point where you can't do it. It doesn't matter what the context is, and that's a really strange assumption to me, that if something was done historically for one purpose, then you have to assume that anyone who does it is doing it for that same purpose, that there can't be a new context behind it. There can't be a different perspective. In the case of Robert Downey Jr. doing it for Tropic Thunder, he was kind of making fun of how out of touch actors are. Or he wasn't, but the movie was. He was portraying the character that was making that point. Whatever, meaningless distinction. In the case of Manson, I'm not exactly sure why he was doing it. His whole album, The Golden Age of Grotesque, was about hearkening back to vaudeville and burlesque, and that's where a lot of the blackface stuff happened. So it could have been a commentary on that era, or it could have been just Manson trying to do something shocking. But of course, because he's Marilyn Manson, nothing he does is shocking because people just assume it's all for shock value. And that's a risk you run as an edgelord for sure. But getting back to the point, if I were to dress in blackface, it would be instantly perceived as racist and offensive, and it wouldn't matter what the context was. And it's really strange to transpose, the history of this gesture has been this. Therefore, that intention that existed when people dressed in blackface in the 1930s must be the same intention that would exist if you did that now. But that's not necessarily the case. Roseanne saying that someone looks like a monkey, maybe she is being racist there. I don't know. I can't look into her psyche and see what her intent is. I don't think she's racist. I think she's probably just crazy. The tweets that she was doing before that whole incident happened kind of, I don't know. You look at Roseanne's Twitter, she comes across like a fucking nut. So I think it's really strange to say, she's obviously just carrying on this tradition of comparing black people to monkeys to disparage them. And it's really weird how if you compare a white person to a monkey, if you say, George W. Bush looks like a chimp, or in my case, I say that Pat Robertson looks like a chimp. If you say that Donald Trump looks like an orangutan, that's presumed to be a slight specifically against that person. But if you say it about a black individual, it's extrapolated to be something that's applicable to black people as a collective. And the justification for doing that is, look at the history. Look at the history. Well, fuck the history. Fuck the history. Look at what's going on now. Look at the moment. I realize that, the thread of history is what led us to this present moment, but we have to take things at face value as they exist now. And you can't just assume someone's intentions in the present by looking at what were the intentions in the past when people did something that's superficially similar, or even more than superficially similar. It'd be like, people in the past, like the whole tradition of, giving the daughter away at a wedding. At one point, that meant, there was literally like, okay, your daughter as a father, you own your daughter, and now you're giving her to this other man. That's not what that means anymore. Now it's just a vestige of that. And no one perceives it as, I'm giving my daughter, who is my property, to this other man, and, only with my blessing could this possibly happen. That's not true anymore, but that's still a tradition. It doesn't mean what it used to mean. You can't just assume that the meaning of something is staying static, and you can't just assume that because one person did something with a particular intent a century ago, that means that is the same intent as someone who's doing that today. Now, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily not the same intent or a similar intent, but it doesn't mean that it necessarily is either. I think it's kind of silly to me. This idea that we can't, we can't do certain things because of a historical context. And it goes right down to the N-word. And I'll play a clip from George Carlin here where he's talking about language and how context matters in language.
I get tired of people talking about bad words and bad language. Bullshit. It's the context that makes them good or bad. The context that makes them good or bad. For instance, you take the word nigger. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the word nigger in and of itself. It's the racist asshole who's using it that you ought to be concerned about. We don't care when Richard Pryor or Eddie Murphy say it. Why? Because we know they're not racist. They're niggers. Context. Context. We don't mind their context because we know they're black.
In fact, I think that George Carlin there was a little bit imprecise in his wording. I don't think he should have said the word context. I think he should have said the word intent, because it's really intent that matters. The context of the word nigger is that, for a long time it was used to suppress black people and hold them down. And that intent is bad. And most people agree that intent was bad. But does that make that word unacceptable to use? I don't think it does. It's to the point now where if someone sings that word as part of lyrics to a song that they like that was written by a black person, they're in trouble. Even though there's absolutely nothing racist about the intent of that. If anything, it's the opposite of racist, because they're enjoying something that was created by a black artist. This idea that double standards can be justified on the strength of historical context doesn't make sense to me. Especially when a lot of people don't even know this historical context. And it's like you keep bringing it up to try to make things that are innocuous seem as though they're malicious or threatening or harmful in some way. What if I want to do blackface to make fun of not black people, but to make fun of the people in the 1930s that used to do blackface to make fun of black people? What if I wanted to do blackface not to insult all black people, but I wanted to insult a specific black person? Or what if it wasn't even insulting? What if I wanted to do a character that just happened to be black and it wasn't even a slight against black people, and I wanted to do blackface? Well, I still can't do it, because it's just going to be racist across the board, because we've decided that the historical precedent of people doing blackface in a derogatory and racist manner means that that's the only context that sort of gesture can exist within. And it kind of gets to the point where the behavior matters more than the intent behind the behavior, even when it's completely symbolic. It's saying that a symbol can't evolve, that what something means to people can't evolve, that has to be a static property. And that, to me, is just some of the utmost fallacious garbage that I've ever heard. And it's so commonplace, and it's so unquestioned, and I just don't understand why. Well, I do kind of understand why. It's just, I don't want to pretend like I understand the writings of Wittgenstein, because I don't. But I understand on a basic, rudimentary level what he was talking about when he talked about language games, and how so much of the miscommunication that exists between people is due to people speaking in the context of one language game, and other people not understanding the context because they're playing a totally different language game. And this happens all the time on my Twitter and stuff. I'll say something that I mean to inspire mirth and humor and levity and fun, and then someone takes it way too seriously or tries to deconstruct it as though it were not a joke but a serious philosophical statement or a serious political statement. And then, or just me trying to be edgy. We talked about that a little bit earlier. And people misinterpret things based on their context. And it's like when you appraise somebody's statement about something, you can't examine their words through the lens of your worldview. if you do that, you're going to have a very fallacious interpretation of what they mean. You have to look at the totality of a person's worldview to understand any isolated statement that they've made. If you don't understand what they mean, where they're coming from, what their ideology is, then you're not going to get it. And I think that a lot of times when you're talking about, especially this racist stuff, people don't understand the context I'm coming at it from. You know, when I say, oh, it's ridiculous that black people are offended by the N-word, or that's ridiculous that they're offended by blackface or something like that, regardless of the context, regardless of rather the intent. When I say stuff like that, there's a contingent of people who think that I'm coming from a position of, and they never bother to investigate, by the way. They think I'm coming from a position of, oh, you know, us white people should be free to make fun of black people. And I do think that, but that's not the intent behind why I think those things shouldn't be, examined or used. I think that ultimately, I just don't want there to be double standards. I just don't want there to be things that are good for the goose but not good for the gander. I don't want there to be double standards that are justified by anything. Not history, not, the sexes are different, so it's okay that a man gets this punishment for this crime and a woman gets a totally different punishment. Or it's fair that this person's word is taken over this person's because X, Y, and Z reason. You have to look at someone's statements through the lens of what their ideology is and what they believe. And when I say stuff like that, I'm saying it from a perspective of I want fairness, and it's not that I don't recognize a certain historical context. It's that I don't recognize the idea that the symbol can't change in meaning from one point in history to another. And I think that so much is misunderstood by people because they refuse to take this broader view. They refuse to see things from another person's perspective. They're always not just pushing their arguments, but they're always pushing their own narrative. They're always pushing their own ideology in the form of, it's not just, hey, I'm going to advocate for my own position. Everyone does that, and that's fine. Everyone should advocate for their own position. But the problem is that when you're approaching someone else's arguments and you take a look at their argument through the lens of your existent ideology, then you're not really understanding the intent behind their words. You're not really understanding the intent behind their statement. Because what something means in the context of your worldview and what it means in the context of the worldview of the person who said it are not necessarily the same thing. And a big part of the problem that we experience with communication now is that one person says something and another person looks at it through the perspective, through their worldview, and interprets it that way, and then they address it from that context, and it's like people talk past each other because no one's bothering to try to comprehend the intent with which words are spoken or the intent with which actions are taken. What it boils down to ultimately is there's just not enough empathy, and it can't just be about emotional empathy. That's a good thing too, of course, but it has to be about intellectual empathy. It has to be about creating a microcosm of another person's thoughts within your head when you're evaluating the statements that they're making. To say, okay, well, what's really making this person tick? You have to understand the psychology and the ideology from which a statement is promulgated before you can possibly understand that statement or react to it in a meaningful way. And am I guilty of reading statements superficially? Yes, we're all guilty of it. But I think that there has to be a greater cognizance of that, because otherwise we're never going to solve these issues that exist with our communication with each other. And that's just something that's been on my mind lately, and I don't know how well I expressed it. I don't know if what I just said made a lick of sense or was it all coherent. But that's kind of the fun of a ramble, and you need to ramble every now and then. So, yeah, fuck off. Have a good day.